My name is Benjamin L. Corey, and I was raised a child of American fundamentalism. Or in America, we would say a child of the religious right, and went on to be a soldier for that cause. Although they are the same people that gave the world President Trump, so now we all know they were kind of religious wrong. But be that as it may, and even though back in America, I and fundamentalism have been spending the past couple of years having a wee bit of a public spat. As I reflect on our theme for tonight, the idea that we are a people sent, it takes me back to my childhood growing up in those churches and just realizing that no matter how deeply I may disagree, and no matter how badly and forcefully I may oppose my old tribe, the one thing that I will be eternally grateful for is the fact that from the earliest age of my life, somehow it was instilled deep inside my being that to be a Christian means that you and I are part of a special tribe of people who are a people sent. And it was that very thing that led to a lifelong thirst to understand everything that I could grasp about God. It developed this insatiable thirst for that. And along with that, it also led to my love and fascination and curiosity for different people and different cultures. I remember even as a child, I grew up in a small farm town where there wasn't much entertainment or anything going on, and a lot of people never kind of went beyond that point right on the horizon. And so for me as a child, one of the most exciting things that could happen in our small town was when missionaries would come to church and share their stories from whatever faraway country they had been working in. For me, it was fascinating on a level because I was so curious about people. But it was also one of those moments where I, even as a child, was able to connect with this idea that as a Christian, you and I are part of a special tribe of people who are a people sent. And here, as a kid, as I would listen to these missionaries, it was almost like seeing a celebrity because, oh, if we're a people sent, here is a real live person who answered that call and was a person sent. And so while I may disagree, the one thing that I take from my childhood is this truth, that you and I are a people sent. But you see, the very term a people sent or a sent people naturally invites all kinds of follow-up questions. Like, what does that even mean? What do you do with it? And if we answer that incorrectly, if we even get our answer slightly off, we may be a people sent, but we can end up being a people sent who end up doing irreparable harm, and even worse, irreparable harm in the name of God. And so there is no greater question than to return back to our core mission as Christians and to ask a few questions. Now, of course, as a kid, when we would ask the question about what did it mean to be a people sent, our very first thought would go to, well, to where? If we are people sent, to where? And we always focused on geography. And I may have spent 8 years in seminary trying to ask and answer every possible question that I could. But the most powerful question I have ever encountered on my Christian journey, and a question that I actually think could radically reshape how you view the rest of your life from this evening onward, was something that I didn't even come up with in seminary. It was actually one night where I was just sitting and watching television with one of my daughters. I have two teenage daughters, 19 and 16, and I was just watching Netflix one night with my daughter, and we happened to stumble upon a show of fiction. And I can tend to be a little bit snobby with fiction and usually don't read it or watch it. For some reason, my brain thinks it's a waste of time, and I want to be engaged in something more. And that night, I realized that there were a lot of things going on in fiction that were actually of value to me. And that night, we were watching a show about time travelers. And at first, it was hard for me to get into it because it was so outside of reality that I didn't know how to connect. But as I watched, and this particular show was about a group of people who were sent to various moments in time on a specific mission in order to influence the events that happened and to steer the future of the story into a better direction than where it was currently headed. And each time this group of people, this team sent out to change the future, arrived somewhere, the question that they would ask was never, where have we been sent? But to when have we been sent? And learning to ask that question, even though it sounds awkward and at first it almost even sounds grammatically incorrect, but if we take the time to ask this question, to when have I been sent, becomes the most powerful question that you may ever ask on your spiritual journey of following God. Because while the question of where points us to geography, the question of when reminds us that we have found ourselves within a story. You were not here at the beginning of the story. We may not be here at the end of the story, but you were born into a story, whether you chose to be or not. And when we ask, to when have we been sent, it reminds us of the importance of getting a solid grasp of the story that we have found ourselves in. If you've ever tried to follow a movie after even just missing a couple of minutes of the opening scene, or you leave the theater midway just to go to the bathroom for a moment and you come back, sometimes you realize that in that moment there was something I missed, that now when I watch it the second time, I realize the significance of that small detail and how that completely changes the way I see the entire story. And so that night, I began to ask myself, not to where have I been sent, but to when have I been sent? And so to reorientate ourselves to this story that I believe God is writing and that you and I have not only been born into, but that we have been invited to be co-authors and co-creators with the divine. To reorientate ourselves to that story, the first things that we must do is we must return to the beginning and make sure that we really understand the beginning. And then the next thing we must do is we must also look at the ending of the story, because like those time travelers had an idea of where the future was headed at that moment, so do we, giving us an advantage. And so when we look at the beginning and the ending and we make sure that we have our grasp, we can see that it changes everything. You see, for me growing up, I feel as if the story of God, the beginning of God's story, was told to me in a way where there was just one little thing left out, as if I had run to the bathroom and missed that part and started the story just 2 seconds too late. And it altered the entire course of my life, and not for the better. You see, the way I was taught God's story was it began like this: you are a sinner. Yeah, it all started and you're a sinner because they were sinners and now you're a sinner. And then they use all kinds of ways to explain it. We would even have bracelets with different colors trying to point us to how to share it with others. And there was this black one on the bracelet, right? And that would say, oh, you are a sinner and you are black with sin. And you need to be cleansed because God cannot stand to be in the presence of sin. And looking back, I can't believe they would say that because it denies Christology. If Jesus was the actual image of God in human flesh, well, that destroys the whole argument that God cannot be in the presence of sin. But for me as a child, believing that I was really black inside was actually something I believed and made perfect sense to me. Wasn't ever a hard sell. But then I was sold the story of Jesus, which is supposed to sound great, but the way they explained it was, and now because of the blood of Christ, God doesn't look at you. When he looks at you, he doesn't see you. He sees Jesus instead. And so in this case, the cure became as bad as the disease. Because the other message that sent me was that, oh man, even though Jesus took the beating from his dad and let me hide behind him, he still can't even, I'm forgiven, but he can't look at me. When that sinks deep inside of you, you see, the beginning of a story tells you who you are. It establishes who all the players in the story are. And because God's story started just a few seconds too late, I believe that I was absolutely one of the bad ones. And I carried that with me. That idea that even having been forgiven, that God just could not look at me, just led me to be a person who spent his entire life struggling with relationships, struggling to allow myself to be loved without feeling gross about it, struggling to give love in return, struggling to love others because they were all black too. This really altered my self-image in ways that I am still untangling in my 40s. But when we return to the beginning of God's story without the missing piece that was left out for me, we see something different. Because let me tell you, God's story doesn't start with the fact that you are black and he can't look at you. That part isn't even in there. What it starts with is God in a garden, in full relationship, unbroken with humanity and unbroken relationship with those around them and with the creation around them, where humanity had this daily purpose, where they had this future goal that they were working towards, and everything was undisrupted. But then something in the story did go wrong. The way that God intended life to be, the harmony, the relational unbrokenness between so many things, it was disrupted, and that disruption is what we call sin. It's not something that we are. It is a force that is influencing the universe and impacts us, and that sometimes we participate in and other times we do a good job pushing back against. But sin is just this disruption of God's shalom and anything less than life as God had intended it. And we're also told that we were made in the image and likeness of God. And of course, in the New Testament, we find out that the only way to describe what God is to say that God is love. And so when we return to the beginning, what we could really say is that God created this in a beautiful balance. And God created you in his image and likeness, which means you were created in the image and likeness of love itself, for the purpose of giving and receiving and reflecting this love both to others, to God, to the created order, to everything. At the central essence of your reason for existing is love, because that's who God is and that's who you were made to model. And so then we have to turn to the end of the story. to orientate ourselves before we can find ourselves here in the middle. And of course, I was taught an end of the story that was equally as bad as the beginning. In American fundamentalism, we were taught that the world was coming to a hail of gunfire and everything is going to burn down. Quick, let's get everybody in the bus. That was the only hope. And in fact, we were even taught that there was only going to be a few people in the boat because the vast majority of every human being that was ever created was created for the purpose of burning in hell to display God's glory. Right? And it was weird because even as a kid, I'm like, doesn't sound like very good news to me, but I believed it. And you see, when you believe, at the beginning of the story, when you believe that your identity is bad and the player can't even, the person that you want to love you most can't even look at you, you adopt that identity. And when you add an end to the story that tells you everything is hopeless, just your only hope is escape, that actually leads you to start acting as if that's true. If you believe you're unlovable, you act as if it's true. If you believe that the world is coming to this horrible end and nothing can be done to stop it, you act as if it's true. And I have spent a very broken life acting as if those things are true. But they're not. Because you see, the end of the story actually ends exactly like the story began at the beginning. You see, the disruption that happened, it doesn't exist in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and it doesn't exist anymore in Revelation 21 and 22. Because the end of the story ends with God here on earth, and this disruption, this disruptive force is gone. The story ends with God returning to a garden where he is in unbroken relationship with humanity, made in his image and likeness, where there is healing among people and entire nations, where there is a garden, and where this disruption will never, ever, ever happen again. And so when we ask when have I been sent in God's story, the first thing that we have to do is really make sure we have the accurate beginning and make sure we have the accurate end. And then we can find where we appear in God's story. And then we know our entire reason for existing. So let me tell you that part. There is a philosopher named Gustav Freytag who argued that there were 5 stages of a compelling story. And I believe the story that God is writing, and he is inviting us to write with him, is a master story that follows these 5 stages. You see, first you have the exposition stage, which is all of the background information you need to understand the key players in a story. And then something in that background stage, that exposition stage, goes wrong. And that thing that goes wrong now drives the rest of the story. And so the second part of a story is this building, this rising action. And what it is it is this chapter of the story where things are moving to a climactic moment that is going to change everything. And so we see this climactic moment building throughout the Old Testament as people testify to the fact, no, the world may look broken now, it looks horrible, but he has promised way back there in the garden where it went wrong, he said, I am putting together a plan. And the moment God says, I'm putting together a plan, the world enters this rising action stage. And then it builds with the most climactic moment ever. The moment where God himself says, oh, you thought death was the end? Plot twist. And so after this climactic moment, a good story moves into a stage called the falling action stage as it moves towards a final stage of resolution. We've established that the final stage of resolution is where all the things that were broken are made right again. So what is this stage called the falling action stage? Well, the falling action stage is the stage in a story where the impact that was achieved at the climactic moment is lived out and fulfilled, and the story inches closer and closer to this end point of resolution. So you, my friends, have been born into what I think is the most exciting period of God's story, because the climactic moment has already happened. You see, when Christ rose from the dead, it was almost as if God is saying, see, I can make all things new. I can fix all that which was disrupted. And that is where we are going to steer the story and finish this one out. And so you and I were born into this chapter of falling action. So what is your role in God's story? Well, Paul calls it says that we have been given this ministry of reconciliation because God is reconciling all things. When we finally get here, all things will be reconciled, but they are not yet. That disruptive force still exists. And so for those of us here in this stage, it is our role to live out the reality of that climactic moment and to show the world that the good news of the gospel isn't that the resurrection happened, it's that it happens. And so our witness to the world as a people sent are to be people who recognize that day in and day out we cross paths with all sorts of other people. And every single person has a story. And every single story has its own degrees of disruption from the way God intended it to be. Whether it's their relationships with each other, with creation, with God himself. Whether it's disruption between having a purpose or future goals. Every story you cross is going to have these different levels of disruption. And as somebody in this falling action stage, well, we get the exciting job of doing whatever we can in these individual stories to move them in a direction where things are a little less broken and a little more right. And together, as a tribe of people who are people sent, if we are all busy working in these individual stories, making them a little less broken and a little more right, collectively we inch God's story to that closer and closer point where everything is now the way it was supposed to be. Now, often we don't engage our role in God's story because we feel inadequate. We leave it to the leaders of the church. We feel like we need some kind of special this or that to be able to do our job. And so, what is your role? Well, my friends, I don't want inadequacy or fear of any of those things to get in the way. Because there's no real hierarchy in this special tribe of people who are a people sent. We are each part of this story because we have something to play. And the way I like to remember this is by carrying a little red paper clip in my pocket. Try to whenever I can, because you see, there was this person named Kyle McDonald. And when Kyle was a kid, he liked to play this game called Bigger or Better. It was just a game he played with kids in his community, and if you had something, you would try to trade it, and the goal was always to trade it for something bigger or better or of more value. And so when he became an adult, he decided to try this professionally to see how far he could get. He started with a little red paper clip, and he traded it for a pen shaped like a fish. And then he traded the pen shaped like a fish for something else. And he started trading up, and he went from a generator to a snowmobile to this and to that. And eventually he found himself trading a vehicle. And then he ended up trading something to earn a role in a movie. And then after the role in a movie, he ended up trading it for a farmhouse in Canada on land. And it all started by just playing that little red paper clip that was in his pocket. And so, what I would invite you to remember, my friends in Wellington, New Zealand, is that you and I are part of a special group of people that have been sent on a divine mission to do nothing less than to influence individual moments over and over again, little by little, until the entire story begins to take this magnificent shape at the end, where all of the broken things are fixed. And that along this journey, there are going to be different moments of time where you're going to reach into your pocket, and as you navigate different people's lives and different stories, and some days you're going to have something really big you can play that's going to change their entire future, their entire story. And some days you just have something small, something that might encourage them, make their heart a little less broken and a little more right. And so I pray tonight will be the night that you'll embrace your place in God's story. That you'll remember that the most powerful question you could ever ask is, to when have I been sent? And then just to play whatever God's put in your hand. And so collectively, story by story and moment by moment, we will make things a little less broken and a little more right, and do nothing less than change the world. Thank you.